Hello, Mr. Ullman here. I want to kick off this unit, which is all about DNA and how genetic information gets passed on from one generation to the next, with the topic of reproduction. Reproduction is obviously one of the key characteristics of life. All things need to reproduce in some way or another. It's a fundamental part of every living cell, from the simplest of bacteria to the most complex of animals. And even though humans are not the only species that has sex for fun, sex is ultimately about reproduction. It's about ensuring that your DNA is going to pass on to that next generation. And who wouldn't want to see that happen? Then again, sometimes things are not quite so pleasurable to see. But whatever the outcome, all living things want to see that end result, to have some offspring that will have their DNA and have that DNA pass on. Now, reproduction does occur in two main modes. We break it down in asexual, which is going to be found in a lot of single-celled organisms like bacteria, and obviously sexual reproduction, in which one person's DNA is going to be combined with another individual's, and that combined DNA is going to make up the genetic information, that genome of the offspring. We'll focus mostly on sexual reproduction, and the question is, why is that the case? When we look at the chart here, if we start with a single female, that single female divides, and then divides again, we can very quickly get exponential growth in terms of the size of the population. And if the ultimate goal is to reproduce and to see your DNA pass on, that's certainly most efficient. Yet, when we look at the path that humans take, along with other animals and plants that undergo sexual reproduction, a female combining their genetic information with a male, and then that process repeating again and again, and we can see that it takes a lot longer, or it takes a lot more offspring per mother in order to see the population rise. And even when the female does reproduce and produce some new offspring, it's not only her DNA, but it's really offspring with combined DNA of hers with her mate. And the reason that we need to look at this has to do a lot with how fit is the next generation going to be. And one of the things that we'll see later in this unit is that DNA can change, that DNA has mistakes, that the copying of DNA leads to mutations, and that those things are ultimately very detrimental to the health of the offspring. And this idea of combining your DNA with someone else's ensures that the product is going to have a mix of DNA, and as a result is probably going to be more likely to be healthy and to survive and not have any particular diseases or disadvantages that might come with a simple cloning of yourself. Now, when we look at some other animals, we have some interesting things like parthenogenesis, so in things like the whiptail lizard, where they are all female, but depending on their hormone cycle, which you can see pictured on the bottom right here, they will still have sex, but they might take the role of a female. They might take the role of a male or male-like in terms of their partnering with another. So there's no functionality here. When they're acting as the male-like, they're not actually becoming male. They're just taking the position that a male would take from other species. Ultimately, when they reproduce and lay eggs, they're going to be laying eggs which are clones of themselves. There are lots of options in terms of fertilization. So fertilization could be internal or external in terms of the sperm physically entering the female's body, or the sperm being external to the female's body, the female laying eggs and then the male depositing the sperm onto the eggs. Now, when we look at human reproduction, obviously you need to be aware of structures and functions. There is a little more detail on these charts than you need, but this is certainly something that you can take a look at to be able to review some of those parts. Spermatogenesis is the process that we use to describe what's happening inside the testes in terms of making sperm. And the hormone chart here that controls the hormones that are responsible for controlling sperm production. Again, it begins in the brain with the hypothalamus. The arrows here showing the blue, the brown, and the black arrows here showing some positive positive message being sent. So here first the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, which sits just below the brain. The pituitary makes the combination of FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the Leydig cells. You can see the oval here for the testis, of which again there are two testes. And testosterone is going to be produced by the Leydig cells. That testosterone is going to stimulate spermatogenesis in the testes. The anterior pituitary makes follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the Sertoli cells to undergo spermatogenesis, to make those sperm. You have the negative feedback here at multiple levels. We have feedback to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus. Once the testosterone is produced, once the sperm are produced, then negative feedback is telling the hypothalamus and pituitary to shut things down. So when we look at hormones, hormones always need to have these forms of control and regulation. Again, regulation is very important for living things because we have limited resources, limited time, and generally speaking, too much of anything is going to be detrimental to the body. So, too much testosterone is going to cause a lot of severe problems all throughout. Too much LH or too much FSH. All of those things are going to impact, and they need to be maintained at certain levels. And so part of homeostasis is being able to ensure that we have ways of controlling exactly how much of different processes happen in the body. Now I'll flip over here to the female processes. We have oogenesis, and we have what I'll spend a little more time on, which is hormone control in terms of the menstrual cycle. And not surprisingly, things are fairly easy in men and pretty complicated in women. So as we look at oogenesis, first of all we have we do start with that single germ cell, and the process of the maturation of the egg cells into mature ovum is going to begin at puberty. It's about 1 per month, but it's sometimes 2. And that would explain some of our cases where we have fraternal twins. And this process ends at menopause because these eggs, these immature eggs, are present at birth in the ovaries of a baby girl. Yet, over time, we can have mutations and we can have issues develop inside those eggs. And so it's important that that process ends at mid-age, because if that process of releasing eggs continued later in life, there'd be a greater risk of birth defects and of really harmful mutations happening in those eggs and in the resulting embryos. Furthermore, just in terms of the health of the mother, if you were 60, 70 years old, in many cases your body is just not capable of being able to provide the nutrients and physically being able to carry that child to term. And so it's important that that process is going to shut down at some point in your 40s, 50s, up to 60 years old. One cell here, as opposed to the 4 sperm that are produced, is actually only going to produce 1 fertilized egg. Or sorry, not 1 fertilized, 1 mature egg, 1 mature ovum that's going to be released. And so to take a look here at a little bit of the process of how it is that happens. So we start up here with the control by the hypothalamus. So we still have the same start that we had in the male hormone chart. We have the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is going to stimulate the pituitary. The pituitary is going to make a pair of hormones, FSH and LH. So far all of that is going to be the same as what we saw in males. Now already we have a difference here in terms of some regulation, and so we'll come back to those pluses and minuses here in a second. Now the FSH is going to, once it's released into the blood, it's going to travel, and when it gets to the ovaries, that's where it's going to start to have its impact. Now, the F stands for follicle, and follicle is often what we refer to as the layer of cells that surround the ovum. And so that layer of cells is kind of helping is going to be important in terms of seeing the egg cell to be released later on in the menstrual cycle. So FSH, it's stimulating the follicle to grow, the follicle around the egg, and that follicle needs to grow in order to lead to the egg being released. Now the LH, as the LH is released, it's also going to travel through the blood. It's going to increase slowly over the course of the menstrual cycle. So if you can kind of consider one cycle from the beginning here on the left of this chart to the end of the cycle on the right. Now, as the FSH stimulates the follicle gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And once the follicle is matured, the follicle is actually going to rupture. And when the follicle ruptures, the egg is going to be released. Now, if we look over here, we can see here's the immature follicle. Here's it as it grows, gets larger and larger. You can see again this layer of cells that surrounds, and that's the egg cell in the middle. That's where it's mature. This is still inside the ovary. And at the point once it's mature, it's going to fuse in kind of a giant, mentioned as a giant exocytosis, or a macroscopic exocytosis happening here. The follicle will fuse with the side of the ovary. It's going to rupture and then release that ovum out. And then once the ovum has been released from the ovary and starts to travel down the oviduct, it generates this other layer of cells called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum surrounds the ovum, and it's going to be producing some other hormones. Now, where the complexity begins to increase is when we start to look at some of the interaction between some of the female hormones. So we saw FSH stimulating the follicle grows. We saw LH. When LH spikes, is ultimately what's going to cause ovulation to occur. But something needs to make the LH increase. So what happens is that FSH causes the follicle to grow. As the follicle grows, the follicle cells, these cells surrounding the ovum, start to produce estradiol, also known as estrogen. So the estrogen, which is released in larger and larger amounts, so you can see it increasing. Once the estrogen peaks, that is going to cause a surge in the amount of luteinizing hormone. Once the luteinizing hormone surges, that is what is going to cause the follicle to fuse and to rupture and to release the egg. So at this point here, this dotted line represents ovulation. That's again the point at which the ovum leaves the ovary. The ovum is going to start to travel through the oviduct and has a couple of days to make that journey, during which it's going to be ready for fertilization. So if sperm comes in contact with the ovum, the sperm will fertilize the egg, and then we're going to potentially have a pregnancy. Now, once the ovulation occurs, then LH amounts are going to crash. Follicle stimulating hormones never get too high, but those are going to again decrease in amount after ovulation, and that's going to be due to some negative feedback. Now, once the ovum is released, it has this new layer of cells called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to be responsible for producing a fourth hormone called progesterone. So progesterone here, which is symbolized here by this orange line, is going to increase and increase and increase during the second half of the menstrual cycle. Now, both of these things are going to have an impact on the uterus, and that's the ultimate goal of the egg, is to be fertilized by a sperm and to end up in the uterus. Now, when we look at the beginning of the cycle, estrogen levels are very low. When estrogen levels are low, the thickness of the wall, of the muscular wall surrounding the uterus, is going to be relatively thin. Now, as estrogen, which again was produced by the follicle, by the developing follicle, as estrogen increases, then that is going to trigger the increase in the thickness of the wall of the uterus. So the uterus is getting thicker and thicker and thicker as it's kind of engorging with this muscle tissue and blood. And then when progesterone increases, and progesterone again is going to be developed by that layer of cells surrounding the ovum as the ovum is traveling towards the uterus. So this layer releases the progesterone. Progesterone sends a message to the uterus, telling the uterus to increase even further the thickness and the blood supply to get ready. Because if this egg is fertilized and it ends up here, that egg needs to implant and use that blood supply in order to be able to provide nutrients for the fetus. So those two are working together, the progesterone and the estrogen, to increase that wall. Now, if after a couple of days, if there's no fertilization that happens, then that layer of cells, the corpus luteum, which surrounds which is going to surround the ovum, it's going to start to degenerate, stop producing progesterone. So you can see progesterone drops, and once progesterone levels drop, estrogen levels also drop. And when those levels drop, that's going to give some negative feedback to the uterus. So the uterus is then going to shed all of that. Those thick walls and all that blood through the process of menstruation. And so that reduces the thickness of the uterus, and then that cycle is going to reset for the next 4 weeks. Okay. Now, in terms of some feedback, so hypothalamus is going to have some negative inhibition by a combination of estrogen and progesterone. So if estrogen and progesterone are high, which again is happening at this stage or during a pregnancy, then there's going to be no production of GnRH. If that is not produced, then there's going to be no FSH and LH, which means there's going to be no ovulation. So that inhibition is important because if there is the possibility, if there's a fertilized egg that maybe is going to travel, or if there is a pregnancy, then the body doesn't want the ovaries to continue to release new eggs, because there needs to be just one pregnancy at a time. Now, if the level of estrogen is very high, like in the case of when we see at step number 5 right here, when estrogen is very high, then we do want a production of LH, because we need that LH to cause the ovum to actually be released. So there we have, if we have both of those hormones, that says no, but if we have just the estrogen, that's saying yes. Finally, the pituitary inhibited by low levels of estrogen. So if estrogen levels are very low, then we don't want the follicle to be released, because if estrogen is low, like it is here at the beginning, then that's telling us that the follicle is not mature. If the follicle is not mature, then the ovum is not ready to be released. So we have this complex interplay of the brain with the ovaries, with the uterus, and we have these 4 important hormones, each of which is working to both trigger and inhibit each other so that they can all be at the right levels at the right time, so that this one little cell, when it's fertilized, will be able to have the right environment for it to be able to grow and develop. So again, a little bit complicated, but it's what needs to happen in order to ensure that the timing and the rhythm of this process is going to be best suited for successful reproduction. So with that, that's reproduction. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know.